So clarificatory questions are particularly pertinent, I think.
Okay.
I'd rather not get into the woods of Hegel until the end, because I know that the woods become very tangled very fast.
Okay.
So clarificatory question. Go on.
Yeah, no, continue, please. It's fine.
Substantial philosophical issues or issues about Hegel, perhaps it's best to leave to the end. But certainly clarificatory questions are welcomed.
Okay, I think we are live now on YouTube. So today our talk will be by Graham Priest. And as Graham said, if you have any questions of a clarificatory nature during the talk, please feel free to raise them. And the interpretive questions concerning Hegel, we will get to, please save to the end. Okay. All right, yeah, so without further ado, Graham, please, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, so this talk will be a bit different from what we've heard so far, because I'm not a Hegel scholar, and I know that most of you are, and I'm sort of a logician and most of you are not, but that's okay. We'll have plenty of common ground to talk about. Let me tell you what I want to talk about. The theme of these seminars is Hegel and Dialetheism. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. But I want to talk about it from the perspective of a little bit of formal logic to try to persuade you that something illuminating can be said from the perspective of formal logic about these issues. So here's where we're going. First of all, I need to give you some background. And I'll give you some background on Hegel, which you'll know already, most of you. And then a bit of background on paraconsistent logic, which may be familiar to some of you, but maybe not. But I want to get those bits in play before we start to talk about substantial matters. Then I want to give you a formal model of dialectic. I take my life in my hands doing this, but I think it's kind of fun. And it uses the techniques of paraconsistent logic. So in section 2, I'll tell you about the model is. Now, warning, that is a very abstract model. Please be patient, because after I've given you the bones, as it were, I'll then put some flesh on it. And first of all, I'm going to talk about Hegel, and I'll have a look at two parts of Hegel which instantiate the schema. And you can probably guess what they are. One is being a nothing for the logic, and the other is the master and slave from the phenomenology. And then I thought I would do some Marx, because Marx takes over, in some sense, the Hegelian dialectic. And you can certainly find parts of Marx where he applies the schema. One is with money in the first few chapters of Capital Volume 1. And then there's a sort of more global instance concerning the transition, the large-scale social transitions, such as that from feudalism to capitalism. So I know this is a Hegel seminar, and if the time's getting on, we won't talk about Marx, but if there's time, we'll do a little bit of Marx as well. So that is where we're going. Okay, so first of all, the background. Let's take background on Hegel first. Now, first point is this. Hegel is a dialetheist. That is, he thinks that some contradictions are true. And to be honest, I don't think this is contentious. Look, here is a statement from the logic. Common experience says that there's a host of contradictory things, contradictory arrangements, whose contradictions exist not merely in external reflection, but in themselves. And in case you're worried there that by contradiction, Hegel doesn't mean what I as a logician means by contradiction, he goes on. External sensuous motion is contradiction's immediate existence. Something moves, not because at one moment it's here and another moment it's there, but because at one and the same moment it is here and not here. Because in this here, it at once is and is not. Now, you don't get blunter statements of contradiction than that, okay? What's going on here? Well, there's a reference to motion, there's an implicit reference to Zeno. We'll actually come back to this quote later on. But now I just give you to show you that Hegel asserts boldly contradictions. This is not a one-off thing. So in his lectures on the history of philosophy, there's this discussion of Eubulides, who invented the liar paradox. And Hegel discusses the liar paradox. And this is what he says. The liar both lies and does not lie. For here we have a union of opposites, lying and truth, and their immediate contradiction. Okay, it's another bald contradiction. Neither is Hegel's Dialetheism an accident. Obviously, Hegel is developing ideas from Kant, and probably Fichte and Schelling too, but certainly Kant. And in particular, the transcendental dialectic in Kant is really important. So in the transcendental dialectic, as you know, Kant gives arguments for 4 pairs of contradictions. But he thinks that the arguments are not sound in modern logical terms, they're fallacious. And he diagnoses the fallacy in the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Now, Hegel fairly famously attacks the distinction. There is no distinction here. Consequently, Kant's antinomies are sound arguments. At least that's what Hegel thinks. And of course, they have contradictory conclusions. That's where Hegel's Dialetheism is coming from. Okay, so it's no accident. So again, let me give you a quote from Hegel. This is a longer quote, but bear with me. This comes from the Lesser Logic. In the attempt which reason makes to comprehend the unconditioned nature of the world, it falls into what are called antinomies. In other words, it maintains 2 opposite propositions about the same object in such a way that each of them has to be maintained with equal necessity. From this, it follows that the body of cosmical fact, cosmical fact, the specific statements descriptive of which run into contradictions cannot be a self-subsistent reality, but only appearances. Okay, that's Kant's view. The explanation offered by Kant alleges that the contradiction does not affect the object in its proper essence, but only attaches to the reason which seeks to comprehend it. In this way, the suggestion was broached that the contradiction is occasioned by the subject matter itself or the intrinsic qualities of the categories, and to offer the idea that contradiction introduced into the world by reason, by the categories of the understanding is inevitable and essential was to make one of the most important steps in the progress of modern philosophy. But the more important the issue raised, the more trivial the solution. Its only motivation was an excessive tenderness for things in the world. The blemish of contradiction, it seems, could not be allowed to mar the essence of the world, but there could be no objection to attaching it to the thinking reason, to the essence of mind. Probably, no one will feel disposed to deny that the phenomenal world presents contradictions to the observing mind, meaning, by phenomenal, the world as it presents itself to the senses and understanding, to the subjective mind. But if a comparison is instituted between the essence of the world and the essence of mind, it does seem strange to hear how calmly and confidently the modest dogma has been advanced by one, guess who, and repeated by others, also guess who, that thought or reason and not the world is the seat of contradiction. Okay, so that is where Hegel's Dialetheism is coming from. And Hegel, in particular, I think these texts are pretty hard to gainsay. Hegel is clearly a dialetheist. He endorses contradictions. And because he's spinning off Kant, and Kant's problematic. Now, that takes us a little way, but it doesn't take us very far, because that Hegel is a dialetheist is one thing, but then what role contradiction he plays in his thought is a quite different matter. That's what happens, I think, in the Dialectic, which I think it's fair to say is the centerpiece of Hegelian's metaphysics. And we'll come to that in due course. So all I've done for the moment is to put Hegel's dialetheism on the table, because I think that is uncontentious. How the role it plays in the dialectic is contentious, but I wanted to start off with the things that weren't contentious. All right, so that's some background on Hegel. Now, some background on power-consistent logic. So let's start not with power-consistent logic, but with so-called classical logic, which is a great bit of the terminology is a great bit of propaganda, because classical logic has nothing to do with the classical civilizations of antiquity, like Greece, Rome, Egypt, Syria, India, China. The logics of those periods, whatever they were, had nothing to do with classical logic. Classical logic is something that was invented at the end of the 19th century, so after Hegel, by Frege and Russell. Then it was cleaned up by lots of people in the 20th century. Anyway, it's the logic you're going to meet if you take a first course in logic nowadays. And in classical logic, every situation, which logicians call interpretation or model, but let's just use the word situation. Every situation divides up the statements into two categories, which are exclusive and exhaustive, and these are the truths and the falses. And a statement is in one if and only if its negation is in the other. So negation toggles sentences between the truths and the falses like that. So there's a picture of an interpretation, and you'll see if something A is in the truths, its negation is in the falses, and vice versa would be. Now, an important principle of inference, nowadays it's usually called explosion, but if you want to give it its medieval name, it's ex contradictio quod libet sequitur. From a contradiction, everything follows. So there it is. It's called explosion because once you have inconsistent information or theory or whatever, everything follows. Triviality, as it's called in the trade. And you can see, given this picture, why explosion is valid. It's valid, as sometimes logicians say, vacuously. So what's the definition of a valid inference? Well, it's actually easier to define an invalid inference, and then a valid inference is just a negation of that. So an invalid inference is one where you've got a counterexample, and a counterexample is a situation where the premises are true and the conclusion isn't. Now, you can see, given this picture, that there is no situation where contradictory premises are both true. A fortiori, there's no situation where contradictory premises are true and the conclusion, whatever it is not true. So explosion is valid, vacuously. All right, that's classical logic. Let's turn to power-consistent logic. There are actually many power-consistent logics, and they work in rather different ways, but the basic trick is the same in most of them. So let me explain what the basic trick is. In power-consistent logic, the situations, the truths and the falses, may overlap. So in classical logic, the truths and the falses in any situation must be exclusive and exhaustive. in paraconsistent logic, they need not be exclusive, they can overlap. In some paraconsistent logics, they can underlap too, but what turns the paraconsistent trick is their overlapping. But everything else you can think of for the moment as exactly the same as classical logic. There's a possible situation once you move to paraconsistency. And notice that this guy A is in the overlap between the trues and the falses. So A is both true and false. Now, negation works in exactly the same way. So if A is true and false, its negation is false and true. Well, that's the same. So if A is in the lens where true and false overlap, so is its negation. So in the situation depicted, A and not A are both true. Okay, they're false as well, but that's irrelevant. They're both true. Now remember, a counterexample to a valid inference is one where the premises are true and the conclusion is not. So look at that little diagram. A and not A are both true and B is not true. So that is a counterexample to the principle of explosion. So in paraconsistent logics, explosion is not valid. And the failure of explosion is the defining characteristic of a paraconsistent logic. By definition, a paraconsistent logic is exactly one where explosion fails. And of course, if you're handling situations or information or theories which are inconsistent, you'd better use a paraconsistent logic, otherwise all hell breaks loose. So in what follows, I'm going to apply the techniques of paraconsistent logic. All right, now I think that's all the background. Let me just pause because I know many of you are not really logicians. Let me pause and see if anyone wants to ask any questions about any of that. So Greg, can you keep your eye on the question board?
Yeah, if anyone has questions, please use the raise the hand.
Okay, I'll take that to be so far so good. Now, oh, actually, there is a little bit more of technical detail that I need to give you, which I just forgot. So far, we've talked about truth and falsity, but we also need to talk about predicates and their extensions. So the extension, let's talk just about one-place predicates, monadic predicates. And a predicate has an extension, that is the things which make it true, the things which satisfy it, and an anti-extension, the things which make it false, that is, make its negation true. So a bit of notation, if P is a monadic predicate, I'm going to take its extension in interpretation to be designated with this little plus. So the extension of P is delta plus P, and the anti-extension is delta minus P. And in standard logic, classical logic, as you'd expect, these are exclusive. So here's a picture in classical logic. So we've got this monadic predicate P. Here's its extension, this circle here. Here's its anti-extension. A is in the extension, so PA is true. There you go. P is in the anti-extension, so not PB is true. Okay, so that's how predication works in classical logic. How does it work in a paraconsistent logic? Well, now, no prizes for guessing. It's exactly the same, except that the extension and the anti-extension can overlap. And so PA and not PA can both be true. I haven't told you how conjunction works, but it works in the obvious way. So here's a situation where for some one-place predicate P, the extension and the anti-extension overlap, and notice that A here is in the overlap. So because A is in the extension of P, it makes PA true, And because A is in the anti-extension of P, it makes the negation true. And if conjunction works in the usual way, it makes their conjunction true. Okay. All right, so that was the end of the technical details. All right, let's move on to the model of dialectic. And warning, this is going to be rather abstract. We'll put some flesh on the bones in a minute, but just bear with me and try and get your head around the abstract model first. So this is a model of dialectical progressions. And as I said, that Hegel was a dialetheist is one thing. What role contradictions play in his thinking is another matter. But the central point, the center point of Hegel's metaphysics is the dialectic. And contradictions obviously play some role there. The question is what role they play. Now, the dialectical progression is at its most fundamental in the logic. That's what drives the dialectics anywhere else it occurs, but fundamentally it's in the dialectic. And the dialectic in the logic is a sequence of concepts. What we do is we start off with the most inadequate concept, the inadequate to describe reality, and that's being. And being is kind of vacuous. It's true of things, but it says virtually nothing about them. So in some sense, it's a concept which applies to everything, but it tells you virtually nothing about them. And so it's the least adequate concept to describe reality. And then by this dialectical progress, we wend our way through a sequence of ever more adequate categories until we end up with the absolute idea, which is the most adequate category to describe reality. And the absolute idea is the category which describes the absolute. And by the way, it's the absolute that's thinking through this procedure to generate the categories as well. But we don't need to go into that part of the story here. The dialectic is a sequence of stages, and at the stages we're dealing with categories. Sometimes new categories appear. Hegel thinks there's a last category. Whether he should have thought that is a different matter. We can talk about that if you want to, but as a matter of fact, he thinks there is a last category. And the sequence of categories come in triples. There is a root stage, its negation, and then the dialectical unity, whatever that means, of the first two stages. Sometimes Hegel refers to that as the negation of the negation. And in some sense, the negation of the negation returns us to the root stage, but at a higher level, whatever that means. But anyway, once we reach the negation of the negation, the dialectical triples kick off again. So this sequence cycles through a bunch of triples. Okay, so the next triple starts at stage 4, as it were, and then it's got to start at stage 7 and stage 10 and stage, etc., etc. At some stage in this process, new categories appear. That's quite clear. Something happens to the contradictions that arise in this process. The contradiction is aufgehoben. Aufheben is a term of dark dialectical Hegelian art. And of course, we're going to have to worry about what it means, and lots of people worry about what it means. But it's a word that's almost impossible to translate into English, because it has almost contradictory meanings. meaning to get rid of and to preserve. My German-speaking friends tell me that you have had something if you sort of put it in the attic. So you get rid of it, but you don't really get rid of it because you store it in the attic, okay? All right, so the contradictions that arise in this process are aufgehoben. And what that means is a really serious question. And we're going to have to address that. Because some people read the fact that the concepts are aufgehoben as an endorsement of the principle of non-contradiction. That can't be right because Hegel doesn't subscribe to the principle of non-contradiction, as we've seen. So what the hell does it mean? Okay, we'll get there. So that's the kind of big picture of the dialectic in the logic. Now, we're going to have to think about how these triples work. Okay, so let's take the root stage first. We've got some predicate, P, and we've got some object, A, and A is P consistently. That's stage one. Well, let's draw a picture of it. Okay, so we've got this predicate, P. It's got an extension and anti-extension, and they might overlap, but A itself is in the extension, and it's consistently in the extension. It's not in the overlap. So that's the first stage. We then have to move to the second stage, and no prizes for guessing what happens. At stage two, the negation of that arises. So A becomes not P consistently. So here it goes. A is moved to the anti-extension of P. That's the second stage. What happens in the third stage? This is the dialectical unity of the first two. Well, again, no prizes for guessing. It moves into the overlap. So at stage three, we have PA and not PA, so A lives in the overlap. So stage three is the dialectical unity of the first two stages. Now, we need to think about what happens after that, but just a couple of wrinkles before we go on. I've written that sort of funny angle symbol as logicians write negation. Negation is a contradictory forming operator, not a contrary operator. However, if you read Hegel and Marx, you will see that when they talk about contradictions, they're often talking about contraries, not contradictories. That's worth noting, but it doesn't change the essential picture, because if you've got two statements which are both true and both contraries, then you also have a contradiction. So if something is red and green, those are contraries. It's red and not red, so you've got a contradiction. So I'm not doing any injustice by simply talking about contradictions, not contradictions, although in application, often it's contraries that are at issue. Okay, second wrinkle. At stage three, I've said stage three gives you PA and not PA. In fact, if you look at many of the examples of the dialectic, the relation between the two limbs of the contradiction is actually closer than that. So it's not just that you get PA and not PA. What you'll see is that something's being P is it's not being P. Let me say that again. Something's being P is it's not being P. And if you want to write that in logical notation, you need this little caret symbol, which means that. And so this notation says that A is P is the same as that A is not P. And often at the third stage, you will get that situation. However, that A is P, okay, A is being P is A is not being P actually implies that A is both P and not P by a little argument, which I will forego giving you. But if A is being P is A is not being P, then it follows that A PA and not PA as well. So again, I'm not doing an injustice. I'm just sticking to the basics. All right. So that takes us through the first three stages of a dialectical progression. And what happens after that? Well, you might think, well, we know the process kicks off again. So here's a natural thought. At this third stage of the progression, we've got this contradiction, PA and not PA. You might think that we just repeat the process starting with that. Okay. So then if we do that, at the next stage, we get its negation, and then we get the conjunction of the new root stage and its negation to get that. So that would be your next triple. Now, that won't do. For one reason, because in many paraconsistent logics, PA and not PA implies the negation, it's its own negation. And if it does that, then of course it implies the third moment of the triple as well. So you get no change. Now, there are paraconsistent logics where PA and not PA does not imply its negation. So you could move to one of those logics. But there's a second reason why this move won't work. And that's because it's clear that at the next stage, so this stage 4, something new happens. And in particular, a new concept appears. So this is where the new concept appears. So whatever it is, the root stage of the next triple uses a new concept. I mean, the dialectic is about the appearance of new concepts. They've got to come in somewhere. So let me write the new concept as P dagger. It's related to P, but it's a new concept. Now, what's its extension and anti-extension? Well, its extension is the place where the extension and anti-extension of P intersected. It's the contradictory part, as it were. And we don't need to worry too much about the anti-extension, except that the object A is not in the... Oh, that's a typo, I'm sorry. A should be not in the extension of P dagger. So it's in the extension, but not the anti-extension. So let me draw you a picture which okay, even the diagram's wrong. Sorry about that. So first of all, this shaded area is the extension of P dagger. Okay, so before, in stage 3, A was in the extension, but and so since it was in the extension, anti-extension, it's in this lens shape. So now A finds itself in the extension of P dagger. All right. But at stage 4, it's going to move. So I should have drawn a separate diagram for stage 4. But this diagram indicates the relationship between the extension of P dagger and the extension of P. Okay. Now, the next triple, so this is the beginning, starts with respect to P dagger and some object. We go through the next triple, and at the end of that, a new concept emerges, P dagger dagger, and then the new trick kicks in. So at the end of every third stage, we get the new concepts appearing, and so we generate this sequence of concepts. Okay, now let's come back to stage 4. So this is where the new concept appears. So here's our object A, and it's in the extension of P and the anti-extension of P. So PA and not PA, okay? But the extension of P dagger is this shaded area. And the thing I garbled before was the anti-extension is the non-yellow area. Okay. So A is such that P and not P, but it's such that P dagger A, but that's consistent. Sorry about the garble. Let me say that again. We've introduced this new concept, dagger, P dagger. The extension of P dagger is the contradictory part of P. So since A was in that, we now have P dagger of A. But P dagger of A, or P dagger, has an anti-extension, which is the non-yellow part. And so the statement P dagger of A is consistent. So we're now in a position to kick off the next triple, okay? Because that's what we needed to kick off the next triple. So what's happened to contradiction? Well, we haven't got rid of PA and not PA, it's still there. In that sense, a contradiction is preserved. But P dagger A is consistent. In that sense, we've got rid of the contradiction because we can now describe the state of affairs in consistent terms. So one contradiction has disappeared in the sense, well, let me put it another way. The old contradiction is preserved. We haven't got rid of it. But the contradictory situation is expressed in consistent terms. So in that sense, the contradiction has disappeared. Okay. So you might call that the Aufheben condition. When the new concept appears, it does not get rid of the old contradiction, that's preserved, but it expresses the old situation in consistent terms. So in that sense, it produces consistency. And so the situation that kicks off the next triple is a consistent situation. And that I take to be what's going on with the notion of Aufheben. Okay. Now, that's the very abstract structure. Let me go on and put some flesh on this bones. But again, let me pause to see if there are any clarificatory questions, particularly since I sort of screwed up the explanation at one point. Any questions about the abstract structure?
Michaela, you have a question?
Yeah.
Just one clarification question about this last step.
Can you speak up a bit, Michaela? Michaela, can you speak up a bit, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we say on the Aufheben process here that the content is still contradictory, but the form is consistent? Is that what you want to say?
No, not quite. Close, but not quite. If you describe the situation with P, it's inconsistent. If you describe the situation with P dagger, different predicate, it's consistent. So the old contradiction is still there, but the new but the contradictory situation, A's being here, is expressed consistently by P Dagger. Okay, so whether you've got the contradiction or not depends exactly which predicate you're using to describe the situation.
Okay, Anthony, please go ahead.
Yeah, so earlier, Graham, you described the 3 stages of dialectic as, I forget which number slide it was, but the first stage of dialectic was to say that A is P. The second was to say that it's not the case that A is P. And then the third stage is to say that both A is P and it's not the case that A is P.
Right.
I believe I have that right. Okay. So I guess I was trying to see how that could map onto, for example, sense certainty in the phenomenology. And my suspicion, but sorry, did you want to?
Well, look, I haven't tried to show you how some of the stuff in the text fits this yet.
Okay.
I'm going to go on and do that. So okay. I think it might be sensible for you to hold this point, which is highly relevant, until we get there, and then you can come back at me, okay? Because that's really where all the action is, in fact.
I think Toby has a clarification question.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I do. Thanks. This is very helpful. I do have a question on clarification. Do you think that this abstract model only applies to what you called earlier on the nomonetic predicates, or also relational predicates? I mean, this might be a very complex question to where this leads to, but you said you differentiated between the 2 sorts of predicates, and then I thought you were just repeating with the first one, wasn't you? Weren't you?
Okay, good point. Look, the situation as I described it uses monadic predicates, and you can do the same. You can have the same structure with binary predicates, ternary predicates, and so on. I won't go through the details. It's pretty obvious if you've got your head around what's happening at the monadic level. Now, if you look at the sequence of categories in the logic, Hegel treats them as monadic predicates. Okay, I stand to be corrected in that. So I don't think it's too bad just to stick to monadic predicates. I could be persuaded that that's not the case. But what you do find in Hegel is something a bit naughty. Namely, he talks of binary predicates like identity and difference, and he actually treats them as monadic predicates. He says, he talks about the difference of A. Okay, that's a nonsense. Okay, if difference is a binary predicate, the difference is between 2 objects. It makes no sense whatsoever to talk about the difference of A. Okay, but Hegel does. He plays fast and loose with this. Okay, there are ways you might want to make sense of this. I don't deny that. However, you've got to be careful that there's a bit of sleight of hand going on here. So I don't deny that at some stage binary predicates appear in the dialectic, but you've got to be very careful how you handle them.
Yeah, thank
you. Okay, I think we're good. Graham, please proceed.
All right, good. So let's come back to the putting some flesh on this bones. And let's do Hegel. We may not get time to do Marx now, that's okay. So the primary dialectic in Hegel is in the logic, where you get this sequence of concepts. And I think that it's fair to say that Hegel is kind of stretching things to fit them into this Procrustean bed. So he's got this major tectonic. He wants to fit the world and everything that happens into it. Okay, Of course, the world is an untidy place, doesn't really fit properly. So you have to kind of stretch and bend things a bit to fit into this sort of Procrustean schema. And I think Hegel does that. I think Marx does that. I think Engels is even worse. So I think there's a lot of stretching that goes on in the logic. However, there are clearly places in the logic where this schema that I've described fits. And the most obvious is right at the beginning, okay? Being and nothing. So the first triple in the logic is being, and then nothing, and then becoming, and then you get this new concept, which is determinate being. So let me walk you through that process in terms of this model. So what we need is an object to talk about, A, and you can take pretty much any object you like. I think probably it's better to take reality as a whole. That's what we're trying to describe. So we need a predicate, and that's being, or to put it as a monadic predicate, X is. And so its negation will be X is not. Now, in the text, it's at least translated into English as nothing. Actually, here's a question for textual scholars. What is the word in German which English translators translate as nothing? Is it nichts? Is it das Nichts? Is it nicht sein?
I think it's generally, it is nichts.
Nichts. Nichts, not das Nichts. Just nichts.
Das Nichts. Oh, what are the difference? Because one of the, I mean, the totality of nothing is das Nichts. So the non-entity, das das Nichts.
Okay, if you're using it as a noun, that's true.
Yeah.
But I think in German you can use nichts to mean nothing without the definite article. Is that not right?
Yeah, you can use it also as an adverb. Yeah, ich habe nichts zu tun. Yeah, it's true. Yes. But yeah.
Okay, so which of those does Hegel use?
But he uses nichts, as Tobias says. He uses nichts mainly without the article, but you have in German always the big word, the big letter at the beginning, so you immediately understand that he's not using nichts in the adverbial meaning.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of confusion in this area as to what nothing means. Okay, a couple of semesters ago, I taught a course here with Achille Vasi on things that are not. And all the students were confused about this word nothing. Some people forget that it's a noun phrase, or it can be a quantifier, which don't mean the same thing. Nearly everybody in the class identified nothing with not being, which I think is a mistake, but I think that Hegel's does the same. So the second side of the dialectic here is nichts, or das Nichts. I think Hegel understands it as simply is not, and he might have been better using nicht sein. Anyway, that's the way I'm going to interpret it. Toby has a hand up, but I think that's left over. Paul has a hand up, which is not a leftover. So do you want to?
Oh, I was just going to add, I mean, under nichts, the first sentence reads, nichts, das reine nichts. So he uses both.
Yeah.
But I have always taken das nichts to be the sort of, the word that wears the pants, or whatever, you know, that terrible phrase. Nichts is the heading, and that's the first word, but it's immediately paraphrased by das. But I think, I mean, we can't sort of lose track of the fact that we're not like, this is not Hegel talking in the first person here. I mean, it's him trying to express what would be said with a very limited vocabulary about existence. So, I mean, I think it's sort of a mistake to say that he's sort of choosing the wrong word. He's choosing those words because they're the ones that come up, as it were, in this first pair of words, and they're going to be forgotten.
If he wants to limit his vocabulary, he'd have been better off using Nichtsein, which is even
it's
more
complicated than Nichts. I mean, Sein and Nichts is a straightforward opposition. Sein and Nichtsein is not a straightforward opposition. That's my. I mean, there's this sort of.
Notice they're different parts of speech, Paul.
No, they're both nouns in the way that he's using them. And there's.
Well, but sein, okay, is the abstract noun corresponding to the verb sein, to be, okay? And nichts does not correspond to, let me get this right. Tell me if I'm wrong. Nichts does not correspond to a German verb in the same way.
But why we're not, there's no syntax here whatsoever. I mean, that's what he's trying to get across.
Of course there is.
There's no
Hegel's
syntax.
Talking.
No,
of course there is. Hegel's talking.
Hegel's talking, of course. But the project is trying to, I mean, what he's attempting to do, is convey something about the limitations of thought when one starts with these type of pairs of abstract concepts. Now, of course, he's using the German language to do that, but I think it's pretty explicit that that's how he thinks of the project. Right. So
okay, let's come back to this in the discussion. Okay, we're now deep in the weeds of Hegel exegesis. Okay, let me at least get through a couple of examples, and you can see how I take the schema to fit.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the first stage, the root stage, you've got X is. At the second stage, you've got X is not. So at the third stage, you've got X is and is not. And Hegel glosses this as becoming. And that's kind of puzzling. Why should the union, or the third stage, be the union of, why should becoming be the union of being and nothingness, or being and not being? And there's an answer here. And it takes us back to Hegel's account of motion, or change generally. So here's the quote that I gave you at the start. Motion itself is contradiction's immediate existence. Something moves not because at one moment of time it is here, at another time and another there, but because at one and the same moment it is here and it's not here. So that's is and is not, right? And motion, or change more generally, is something that realizes this contradiction. It is and is not here. So that's why Hegel identifies motion, or actually change generally. Something is in a state of change if it is and is not something. Okay, so that's how being gets in as the third moment, which is the contradictory union of the first two. Okay, now, at this point, according to the model, a new concept occurs, and the concept is determinate being. Why? Because if you've said that something is in a state of becoming, you have said more than that it just is. Its being is determinate in a certain way. Namely, you've said something about it, namely that it's in a state of becoming. Okay, so that's why determinate being gets into the act. And here's a quote from the Logic. Determinate being issues from becoming. It is the simple oneness of being and nothing. From this simplicity, it derives its form as something immediate. Becoming, which is mediating it, is left behind. It has transcended itself And determinate being, therefore, appears as something primary and something from which a beginning is being made. First, then, it's one-sidedly determined as being. The other determinate contained, that of nothing, will also develop itself in it in opposition to the other. So the way I read this is that you've got it is, it isn't. In the third moment, it is and isn't. That's the state of becoming. And then the new concept of determinate being appears. And determinate being is the same as becoming, in the sense that it has the same extension as being and not being, but it has a different anti-extension. That's what makes it a new concept. All right. So that's how the first triple or quadruple of the logic fits the process. Let me give you one more, then I think I'll stop. So this is the master-slave dialectic. Now, the primary dialectic in Hegel is in the logic. This is a progression in thought. But the progression in thought is embodied for Hegel in a progression in the social and even the natural world. So corresponding to the progression in the logic, you get a progression in, let's concentrate on the phenomenology. The dialectic in the logic is not a temporal one. It's one in thought. The progression in the phenomenology is certainly a temporal one because it's in social reality, it's in time. But the time changes in the phenomenology don't track exactly temporally the changes in the logic. So that's not quite what's going on, but there are moments in the temporal dialectic which correspond to the moments in the conceptual dialectic. And the most famous of these is the master-slave dialectic. So let's look at that. So the situation in the master-slave dialectic is this. When people have evolved, become educated, however when you put it, to a certain stage, each of them recognizes him or herself as a being for him or herself. But what they refuse to do is accept that other people have the same right, that other people are not recognized as beings for themselves. But each person requires the recognition of other people. So they need to force this recognition out of them. And then they fight, and one person wins, and one person loses. The person who loses becomes the slave, and the person that wins becomes the master. And the master thinks they've got what they want, because now they have being for themselves, but they sort of force the slave to give them recognition. So they seem to have won, but they haven't really, because what the master forces the slave to do is labor. The slave labors, and because of that, the slave develops all kinds of abilities and knowledge that the master does not have. And so the master is forced to recognize them because they're clueier than the master. So the slave still has being for self. And now the slave has a recognition of the master. So by the dialectical irony, it's the slave who gets what was desired in the first place. Okay, so how do we fit that into the schema that I've described? Well, we've got an object, and let's call the object A. A is a slave, right? So at stage one of the dialectic, both the master and the slave, but particularly the slave, has being for self. At the second stage, the slave has being for other. So the slave is forced into having being for other, for their master. And at the third stage, the slave has being for self and being for other, just because they've obtained the being for self which they had, and now they've got being for other in the recognition of the master. And those two moments are both there. So this is what Hegel says. Both moments, namely being for self and being for other, are essential. In the first instance, they are unlike and opposed, and their reflection into unity has not yet come to light. They stand as two opposed forms of consciousness. That's how the master and the slave start. The one is independent, and its essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent, and its essence is life or existence for another. The former is the master or lord, the latter is the bondsman. But at or after the stage of the dialectic, a new concept occurs. And the concept that occurs now is true self-consciousness. So you could say that before this, the beings were conscious of themselves, but they didn't have true self-consciousness because that requires the recognition of another. So this Dagger is self-consciousness. And this is what Hegel says. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that, and only by the fact that it exists for another, self-consciousness. That's to say, it's only by being acknowledged or recognized. Its moments must, on the one hand, be strictly kept apart in detailed distinctness, and on the other, in this distinction, must at the same time also be taken as not distinguished. Okay, there's your contradiction. Or must always be accepted and understood in their opposite sense. This double meaning is what is distinguished, lies in the double nature of self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is the new concept that appears at this stage of the dialectic. Okay, now I've been going already for over an hour. So I'm not going to do Marx. We can talk about Marx if you want to, but I know this is a Hegel group. So let me end there. Thank you very much for your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing what you make of these things.
Thank you very much, Graham, for your talk. So let's go ahead. We can take questions. And again, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand. Okay, Franca, you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and have the first question.
Okay, I'm going to take the screen down now. If you want me to bring it back, I will, but it's easier when half the screen is not blotted out.
Okay, really briefly, everyone's hand went up like all at once. So I'm starting with Franca, and then I'll just go down my list here. So we'll try to get to everybody. So please, you have the floor. You're on mute still, Franca. Could you please unmute yourself? Thank you. I think you're still muted. You're still muted.
Okay, please. Okay. Okay, I have some problem with the connection because here I am a bit far from the modem. So, well, my question was, Graham, thank you so much for your always clarifying and illuminating contribution to the dialectic themes. And well, my first question, well, I only have one objection, possibly, or it is not an objection, is more, I think, it is more a question, yeah. And it regards the use of the term overlap. The overlapping of properties or predicates of the extension and anti-extensions of properties or the overlapping of truth and falsity. This language, this use of overlapping, well, at first it is a merely verbal, definitional question, but I think it contains something about the problem of the contact we establish between truth and falsity when we speak of true contradictions. And the question in practice is this. I think that, well, or the objection, I don't know. Do you think that Hegel can endorse basically this language, considering that Hegel didn't use set theoretic languages? Well, I think that I always reflected about the fact that Wittgenstein didn't like the set theoretic language in logic, and I've always thought that it was because he was faithful, in a sense, to the idea that if we have predicates expressing properties, and if we have properties in our conception of the world, in our metaphysics, then properties don't overlap, never overlap. And the idea of overlapping is, so to say, a graphic, I don't know why, a visual device to express something which is a border. It is not an overlapping, it is a border, it is a limit. This is a point.
Okay.
What do you think about developing, no, the question was, what do you think about developing a dialectic interpretation of Hegel, of dialetheism in general, without set theory, without the language of contemporary semantics?
Okay, look, when I described the model, I described it in terms that modern logicians use. Could I do that in terms, in purely Hegelian terms? I don't think so, because Hegel doesn't have the language to do that. All right. Now, of course, when you interpret Hegel, you've got to pay attention to his language. But that doesn't mean that you can't use modern concepts to clarify or help to understand what's going on. Philosophers do that all the time. They do it with Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, Lao Tzu, Nagarjuna, Dogen, you know, just because we have tools that these guys did not have. So I don't apologize for using the terms of modern logic.
No, but I don't think that you should apologize, absolutely. The point is that maybe this shift from the non-set theoretic conception of the world, of the logical world, to the set theoretic metaphysics of the world, which is active in our logical language, imports some relevant differences.
No, I take that worry. Look, I've used the word truth.
Do you think it implies some differences?
Look, I take the worry. Let me answer your question. I've used the word truth as modern logicians use it. This is not exactly how Hegel uses it. And I know that Hegel has a couple of terms which approximate the word truth in English, Wahrheit, Wirklichkeit, and I'm happy to listen to Hegel scholars as to what exactly he means by that. And I haven't tried to do justice to how he uses those terms. What I have tried to do justice is to this. Hegel talks about contradictions. By contradiction, he at least often means exactly what I mean by contradiction as a logician. P and not P, and the statements of contradiction are up front in the text. So if I, as a modern logician, am talking about those, I feel free to use the word truth in relationship to those. Hegel is asserting these bald logical contradictions. He expects us to believe what he says. In that sense, he intends them to be interpreted as true in the modern logician sense. I don't deny that he has other uses of the word Wahrheit or whatever, but I'm not trying to do justice to those aspects of thought, merely to the fact that he endorses contradictions in the modern logician sense.
Okay, so I don't mean to interrupt too much, but we have about 43 minutes, so we'll just try to keep things smooth. So I'm going to go ahead and move us to the next question. So sorry to interrupt. Anthony, I think you may be next.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Graham. That was super helpful. I had a question, as I was mentioning earlier, about whether or not to understand the model of dialectic as you offered, right? So you offered a three-stage model where we say A is P, it's not the case that A is P, and A is P, and it's not the case that A is P. And I guess I would have thought, but I'd like to know what you think about this. I guess I would have thought the model might rather run something like A is P, then both A is P, and it's not the case that A is P. And then maybe like P prime or Q, sorry, A is P prime or A is Q, where that involves the introduction of a new, I'm not sure if property is the right word at this stage, right? But some sort of marker, some sort of mark. Because I was thinking about what happens in the first chapter of the phenomenology when sense certainty says, on this proposal of a slightly different or modified dialectical model, says that knowing consists in the immediate reception of a particular. So maybe knowing would be the A, and P would be that description of what knowing is. P would be that criterion of what knowing is. And then in the second stage, sense certainty says, effectively, A is P, and it's not the case that A is P because of the tension between what sense certainty means and what it says, right? What's heralded and announced at the beginning of that chapter. So it wants to say, this, but it can only say this by invoking the mediation of a universal term. So it's both affirming and denying immediacy or something like this. And then the third stage of the dialectic would be something, this is just a proposal. I don't know, if this is the right way to put it, but something like A is P prime or A is Q, however we want to denote the transition from some claim about what knowing is, some affirmation of our commitment to a criterion for knowing, where that's stated in one way and then stated differently the next. And so then it looks like contradiction is absolutely not being rid of, right? It's fundamental to this new proposed model, but it's kicked up, as it were, to a second stage, where the third stage is one in which we can say something new about the contradiction. We've fallen into the contradiction. Sense certainty contradicts itself. It falls into it, and then it contorts, and there's those three attempts that it makes to disavow its own self-contradiction. And then in the third stage, it sort of falls apart, and then it realizes it must be perception. Anyway.
That's good. I'd have to go back and look at the sense certainty stuff in the phenomenology, because it's a long time since I've looked at that. But if I understand what you're saying right, you're actually agreeing with what I said, because you've got this three-stage thing, but the stages you're describing are what I've called stages 1, 3, and 4. All right? You've sort of missed out stage 2, but I think it's actually implicit in what you said. Okay, come back to being a nothing dialectic for a moment. You've got this 4-stage dialectic: being, not being, becoming, and then this new concept, namely determinate being. In the progression you described, you said you start with set certainty, which you do, then you've got its negation, but you didn't recognize that as a separate stage, but it's there implicitly. Then you've got the contradictory union, which you said explicitly. Then you've got this new concept, which describes the old situation. So I think what you said is quite compatible with what I said. It's just that I'm putting in that second stage, which, and it may only be implicit sometimes. I'm happy with that, but sometimes it's not, as in the beginning of the logic.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks. Let's get on to, I see Toby next.
Well, thank you very much for this very helpful talk. And I do have two questions, but they are linked. And in order to bring out the linkage, I'd like to start with something you touched upon very briefly, which is your interpretation or understanding of the absolute idea. And you said of this to be the most adequate category. And I must say, I'm a bit skeptical to this, because Hegel himself speaks of this, the absolute idea, as a method and not a category. And I think this is a crucial difference between, as a method, it is more the idea of how to apply categories. So it's, as a method, it's what leads us to exercising what Kant called spontaneity, the capacity of the concept. And this is not a category. It's more like application, sort of the capacity to exercise the conceptual. And this might be a minor point, but this brings me to this allows me to link my two questions, because in order to come up with an understanding of the absolute idea as a method, the method which is absolute because the application of that capacity kind of changes what is exercising this capacity. The thinking is changing itself through the application of its own capacity. So in that sense, it's absolute because it generates its own movement. It's not absolute in the sense of grasping everything or something, or having a total understanding of what there is, but it's changed itself through the application of its own capacity. And this is, I think, quite close to Kant, by the way, but very different at the same time. But in order to come up with an understanding of this, I think it's very helpful to have a non-classical understanding of the concept. So Hegel's concept of the concept is very different. And I think the dialetheism is only one aspect of this to be. And this brings me now to my two questions. And the first aspect is, you had a tendency, but this might also be a question of clarification, to kind of use predicate and conceptual synonymously. And I don't think this is Hegelian, to put it that way. I mean, it's not bad to be a non-Hegelian, but I think there is lots to be learned from Hegel in this concept, because the idea of the intension and extension, this is very crucial to the Hegelian understanding of the concept. So when he speaks in the subjektive Logik of Einzelheit, Besonderheit and Allgemeinheit, you know, the singularity, the particularity, and the universal, they are not extensional. They are not, this thing here can be all of them. It can be totality, so it can be as a singular quantum, it can be the Allgemeinheit, or it can be then all just a particular, or it can be universal. So it's a different way of grasping a certain object. And so this is what it allows us to do by these intentions. And this is my first question. Do you find this helpful to translate Hegel's talk of Allgemeinheit, Besonderheit, and Einzelheit as intentions? Because this might lead to the big topic of Paul, because Paul is also coming up, I mean, the idea of how to translate the modalities of the judgment. I think it's helpful to kind of use the intentionalistic approach in order to come up with an understanding of Hegel's table of categories. I think it might be helpful, but I would love to hear what you have to think about this difference. And then the second point is something might be rather remote, but this brings me back to what you said in the outline about the problem of the explosion. So if we have in classic logics the definition of A and non-A and non-A to allow for everything, therefore the problem of the explosion arises. I think that I must say that Hegel might be understood as saying it's not true. We don't need the law of non-contradictions to prevent the explosion to happen, so to speak. So, but this brings us to another level of understanding what is conceptual force or inferential force. So I find it very helpful what Robert Random has to say on this of this pragmatics. So if I, the scorekeeping, when Random comes up with this interpretation of the phenomenology of spirit, and when he says, if A as a subject, as a person, as a scorekeeper, trusts B, and B trusts C, then A has to trust C. And this kind of transitivity of A to B to C, might be the logical form of reasoning, and not so much the idea of a deduction, the A and non-A. So we cannot come up with an idea of inferential force without needing LNC in order to prevent the problem of explosion. Could you relate to this? Because I would just love to hear what you have to say about these. This is just my hypothesis. It's just my own way of coming to terms with Hegel's concept.
So you've raised a number of issues there. Let me see if I can remember them. So let's take them in the order that you gave. The first concerns the absolute idea. Now, I think it's relatively uncontentious that the absolute idea is the last category in the logic. I mean, if you look at all the standard commentators, they'll give you a list of the categories, and the absolute idea is the last one. So it's certainly a category, and that's where the dialectic takes us. Now, is it doing more work than simply being the terminus? And the answer is clearly yes, because it's a category that applies to the absolute, and the absolute is the entity which is undergoing the methodological development that you find in the logic. So I wouldn't have put it quite the way that you did. I wouldn't have said it's the absolute idea that's the method. What I'd say is that the dialectic is the method that the absolute employs to take you to this final category in which the absolute finally understands what it is. Okay? But your point was, of course, this concept has got to do some work, and the work has got to explain what it is that's going on in the logic. That's dead right. But I mean, I haven't tried to talk about that, but I agree it's there. Okay, it's just something that is a further part of the story. The second point was about predicates and properties. Now, of course, there's a distinction between predicates and properties. Predicate is linguistic. It's what corresponds to an intransitive verb. Properties are the sort of semantic correlates for those. And you might take them to be extensional objects or intensional objects. You can go both ways on this. Concepts is what the word that Hegel uses for what modern logician would call a property. I don't think that's too contentious. I think he probably thinks of them as intentional things rather than extensional things, but I don't know that that makes a big difference to the story I've told. Of course, if you're going to use the techniques of modern logic, you have to talk about predicates, because that's the kind of language that logicians use. But of course, in talking of predicates, you are talking about their meanings, their intentions, their extensions. So that's implicitly there, often sometimes explicitly there as well. Okay, I can't remember the bits of the logic where Hegel uses the words you used. Remind me what they are. Einzel, and
Einzelheit, Besonderheit, and Allgemeinheit. So singularity, particularity, and universality. So these are the three determinations of the concept. This is the place where I am now, is before he continues to the category of the table of judgments. So this is the first part of the concept as such, so to speak, as a schema.
Cool. So that's part of the logic that went over my head when the times that I've read it. Okay, so I'm not sure what to say about this, but certainly, I mean, I don't think Hegel talks much about predicates. He certainly talks a lot about properties or concepts, And concepts can have many different aspects. You know, modern logicians distinguish between intension, extension. Whether the Hegelian distinctions are tracking things in modern logic, I just don't have an opinion, because I'd have to go back and read that much more carefully than I've read before. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
There was a third point. The third point was about explosion. Okay, so look, people make all kinds of stuff out of Hegel, and Brandon has got his own story to tell. Brandon is no dialethist, I know that. He certainly talks about the transitivity of social relations, of taking people seriously. That's true. That stuff is certainly going on in Hegel. I think Bob's onto something. I think that's a very different part of the story from the logical stuff about validity. It is a story about trust, okay? It's not a story about validity. And certainly the transitivity that you're talking about doesn't really affect explosion. Transitivity is a logical principle. I don't think Bob's talking about that, but if he is, transitivity is completely distinct from explosion. You can have one without the other, and the other without the one.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's go on to Elena.
Hi, Graham. Thank you very much for your very clear and elegant picture of Hegel's dialectics. The point is Hegel's dialectics as elegant as you present it? Probably not. So now what I wanted to ask is in some way related to the previous questions, to the difficulty stressed by my mother of interpreting Hegel's dialectics from a set theoretic point of view, of using the set theoretic terminology, and also what Tobias said about the pragmatic elements in Hegel's dialectics. So that because there is, so in Hegel you don't have a view of logic separated from epistemology and pragmatics and metaphysics. So in a way, if you want to formalize Hegel's dialectics, then you should have also tools in order to give an account of this strange unity of levels of pragmatic and metaphysical level, pragmatic level, logical level. But so my question is, you haven't given an account of what drives A from the extension of P to the anti-extension of P to the intersection. What do you think? What are your suggestions?
Okay, well, several points, Elena. The first is that, no, I don't think Hegel's dialectic in all its gory details is very tidy. I think he's pretty obviously trying to put the thing into a pre-existing conceptual framework, and he's got to torture it to do so. He's got this Procrustean bed and he needs to fit things in. And I think that's dead right. The second point is that, yes, of course, there is a lot more going on in the dialectic than I've said. The dialectic has epistemic elements, metaphysical elements, and maybe some inferential elements too. I have not tried to give an account of all of those. That will be a much bigger undertaking. All I've tried to do is to talk about the logical progression which gives rise to the appearance of new categories. What Hegel makes of matters when those categories appear, how they function in epistemology, I haven't tried to discuss. So I agree with you entirely that there's a lot more to dialectics, and I've said all I've been concerned with is one very small aspect. But to be fair, you know, the notion of being aufgehoben is one of the central aspects. So I don't think I'm discussing a sort of a tangential matter of the dialectic. It the notion of being what it is to be aufgehoben is central. So I think I'm addressing one of the central aspects. Now, third thing, and your particular question, what drives the dialectic on? And that's a bloody good question. The answer that Hegel gives, as far as I understand it, is very different from the answer that Marx gives. So they have certain elements of their dialectics in common, but what they do not share is the story of what pushes the dialectics forward. So let's not talk about Marx now, but let's talk about Hegel. What drives the dialectic forward? Okay, so, you know, the big story in Hegel, as I understand it, is this. You've got this kind of thing called Geist, or whatever that is. I tend to think of it as a world spirit. You know, it is to the natural world what the mind is to the body in the Aristotelian sense. That's how I understand it. But anyway, you've got this thing, Geist. And Geist is going through this thought process. So what drives the dialectic is the kind of thought process that Geist is going through. So Geist is wondering what Geist is. Geist doesn't have many conceptual apparati. And Geist thinks to Geist's self, oh, well, it is. Okay, so that's where you start. There's not much. But then as Geist thinks, well, okay, but I haven't said much. I haven't really said anything which distinguishes a being from a non-being, right? So, okay, so there must be this non-being. Oh, so, but damn it, being a non-being seemed to be pretty much the same. To be is the same as to not be. Oh, so I've got this being and not being. Oh, well, now I've said something about reality, namely something pretty determinate, namely becoming. So I've said I've got determinate being. So I take it to be that's the kind of thought process that Hegel is describing when he goes through the steps in the dialectic. And the answer to your question then, to summarize, is just what drives the dialectic of Hegel is simply this kind of thought process that Hegel goes through, that Geist goes through.
But do you think it can be formalized?
To the extent that I've tried to do it, yes. But as I've said, there's a lot more to what's going on in what Hegel does with the dialectic than I've tried to capture.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, and then we have some questions from YouTube. So try to be precise and brief if you can. Thank you. Okay, Paul, you're next. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Graham. It's really, really clear, really helpful. And I'm certainly on side with the sort of spirit of the project, right? I mean, and absolutely, I mean, there are some Hegel scholars who just want to say, look, Hegel's logic really has nothing to do with logic, right? That it's all ontology. So don't waste your time doing all this stuff. And I think that's crazy. I mean, use whatever we can to understand Hegel. If you think there's something to be sort of dug out, you know, I mean, I think most of us have that impression that there is something important sort of going on and we'd like to know what it is, and got to use everything, all the resources that we have. So the whole framework, sure. But I'm not sure that when you get to the sort of question that Eleanor brought up, the role of the dialectic in the transformation of the concepts, right? From, what was it, you know, P to P dagger, that sort of thing, right? I'm not too sure when you start looking at that, it doesn't drain some of the sort of force out of your starting point and out of the dialectic sort of claim that Hegel is actually affirming contradictions or saying that there are true contradictions. And the very first example that you gave with involving indexicals, right, here and there, seemed to me, I think you said, I mean, this is a sort of a lay down misere that he's asserting that there are true contradictions. But when you look at what he says about indexicals. Like Anthony referred to the sense certainty chapter, and there's a sort of a famous short paragraph that I'll read. It's 95. He says, "It is then self-certainty itself that must be asked. What is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape of its being as now and here, the dialectic it has in it will receive a form as intelligible as the this itself is. To the question, what is now, let us answer, now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment will suffice. We write down this truth. The truth cannot lose anything by being written down any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, as we shall have to say that it has become stale." I mean, we don't have to write it down, because I can say now is night, and that's perfectly true. And it's not true for you, right? Now, when Hegel deals with judgment forms in the subjective logic, he starts off with those sort of simple, he calls them positive judgments of existence, positive judgments of Dasein. And they're supposed to be sort of examples of what a judgment is, right? It's supposed to be the first example that would come to mind. And they're things like now is night, or, this rose is fragrant. And you meant to think, well, it's not going to be fragrant forever, that sort of thing, right? Now, I mean, even Aristotle doesn't think of those things as contradictions, right? Because in the Metaphysics, he says things are contradictory when they're said in the same way and at the same time, or something like that. And I take it that what Hegel is doing in examples like that is to try to reflect on, try to bring us to see that these are not good examples of judgments, that judgments are much more complex things than utterances like the rose is fragrant. And he says the truth of the rose is fragrant is contained in its negation, or something like that, right? So I take it that what we're meant to think is that now is night and now is day would be contradictory on the presupposition that they're judgments, and they're good examples of judgments. But Hegel's saying they're not good examples of judgments, right? So that the sense of their becoming contradictory just sort of fall away, and that's part and parcel of the idea of getting a better concept of judgment, right? So the part that you've stressed about the role of contradiction in the transformation of categories, here we're talking about the category of a judgment, it seems to me to sort of count against the idea that we should in any way think of those sort of assertions as contradictories. They're contradictories.
Okay. We have a big disagreement here, Paul.
Okay.
Look, first of all, indexicals. We all use indexicals. Hegel does. Indexicals are tricky things, okay? And Hegel does not have the benefit of modern linguistics to help.
I think he says a lot of interesting things about indexicals, but yeah, I don't think we've got omniscience on that.
I agree with you entirely. Okay, now, certainly, if you use indexicals like now, there's a way in which you can use them in a prima facie contradictory way, which is not. So if I say it's now 10:15 and 0 seconds, it's now 10:15 and 5 seconds. Those two statements are contradictory, and it's because the denotation of the word now has changed. Right? Clearly, that's not what that's not a contradiction. I mean, Aristotle says, it's only contradiction, it's the same time, the same purpose, etc., etc. Now, let me remind you of Hegel's own words about motion. Something moves not because at one moment is here and at another there, but because at one and the same moment it's here and not here. And because this here, it at once is and is not. Now, there's no sliding around of time or space in the indexical there. Let me remind you also about the liar paradox. Let me remind you also, Paul, about the liar paradox. Let me finish, then you can come back.
Sorry.
Let me remind you what he says about the liar paradox. He says the liar lies and does not lie. There are no indexicals there. Okay, so whatever is going on, getting rid of the contradiction is not going to help you appealing to the fact that indexicals have different denotations.
We need to be quick here, so maybe very short, Paul. Very short response. Thanks.
No, I mean, I think there's just a methodological issue about who's saying what when we read a sentence in Hegel's Logic. I think it's just a mistake. That's a sort of an obvious mistake. It's an easy mistake to make. It's obvious to make the mistake, if you like. That it's sort of like Hegel affirming something. But I think just about most of the sentences that we're looking at in Hegel are exemplifications of a certain sort of cluster of concepts that he's trying to work with and show the limitations of. And so I don't think there's a sort of a commitment to these things as things we can sort of take out of context and then repeat. Anyway, so that's taking us too far.
If he doesn't mean what he says, then I guess a lot of bets are off. But obviously, this is not something.
He's not saying it. He's not meaning what he says. He's simply not saying it. He is using writing as a way of trying to exemplify and instantiate certain clusters of concepts in certain ways to allow reflection on them to see the limits of them. That's different to saying or asserting something.
Okay, we're obviously not going to resolve this issue now. We'll have to carry on by correspondence, or maybe we can have a Skype chat about it or something.
Yeah, no, that'd be good.
Right. Thanks a lot. So, Michaela?
Thank you, Graham. I have thousands of questions, but I will make just two questions. One is about a point that you mentioned during the discussion, actually, and it's about the difference between Richtigkeit and Wahrheit. Do you have any idea of how this works in your account? Did you consider if it changed anything about Hegel being a dialettist or not being a dialettist? I think he is. But I think that it's interesting to consider this difference when we say, what does it mean that Hegel affirms the truth of some contradiction? And the other question, I was curious about the other point that you were discussing with Paul, the difference between between nothing and not being. Because if I got you, if I understood you right, I think you said that you think that not being is better than nothing for the first, as a category for the first triad. But the problem for me is that not being already have this not, which introduces some kind of determination, which is not already deduced or generated or involved in that very dialectic. So, because being and not being seems that you're like interpreting as the extension and anti-extension, which is, I'm not sure that this is what's going on in the first triad. But I wanted to know something more about this. And thank you so much for that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Interesting questions. Look, as I said to Franca, I haven't tried to do justice to the use that Hegel makes of Wahrheit and Richtigkeit, okay? And I know you've written about this and it's important. I'm not sure that either means exactly what a modern logician means. I think Wahrheit is somewhat different. I think Richtigkeit is closer, but I'm happy to leave that to Hegel scholars. And I'm quite happy with the fact that these are important parts of Hegel's thought. It's just not something I've tried to do justice to. The second point about the second moment and whether it explicitly uses negation. Certainly in the instances of the dialectic I can remember, negation is not used explicitly. Being and nothing, being for self, being for other. But sometimes it's used when he glosses matters. For example, when he explains. Let me come back to that. Although negation is not used explicitly, it's clear that Hegel thinks that these are contraries, being for self and being for other. At that stage of the dialectic, you can't have both. Being and nothing, well, they're opposites. So you have this notion of being opposed, being contraries. And so inchoately, you have a notion of negation sitting in there in the very notion of opposition or contrariness. So I don't think it does an injustice to make that explicit. And I do think, coming back to where I sort of started and decided to stop, that when Hegel glosses in some of the texts, this notion of opposite, he does use negation explicitly in this gloss.
Okay. Is it okay to go on to our last question in-house here, Stefan?
Okay, thanks for your talk. And I'm coming back to Michaela because I also think that Hegel is quite right to use nothing in the beginning and not non-being or not being, because he says that nothing, pure equality with self, completeness, lack of determination and content. So if we say non-being or not being, we already have put a difference in nothing because the non and the being. So, I think that Anselm of Canterbury in his Fall of the Devil makes it pretty clear. Non-ends or non-being. We are referring to being in one sense, but then we are taking it away. So it is already a kind of determined negation if we say non-being. But Hegel says, oh, that's not the case. It's not non-being. It's not related to being. He says it's pure identity with being. There's no difference between being and nothing. So I think he is completely right to say it's not non-being because non-being would put a difference into nothing. And this he doesn't want to. And it's not related to being, not like non-being. Non-being is related to being. Nothing is not related to being. They are simply the same, two expressions for the same thing. Namely, complete lack of determination. They are identical, as he says. In the end, he says, pure being and pure nothing are the same. So, and I don't know if it's a general issue for your interpretation, because isn't it that Hegel in his logic kind of develops the logical space and all of its determinations, and he kind of develops different senses of not or negation, different senses of opposition. There are a lot of ideas of opposition, like relative opposition with slave and master. You cannot say slave without saying master. And there's abstract negation and so on. And I have the impression that from the beginning, you have one idea of negation, which is the propositional negation of non-P. And then you apply it to all modes of opposition in Hegel, but especially the opposition between nothing and being at the beginning seems to be completely different from the opposition of master and slave. I don't think that your formalization is able to kind of depict these differences.
Look, you're right that there are many different notions of negation, and modern logicians will talk about these, as did Aristotle, and they're not all the same. But what makes it a notion of opposition or contrariety or whatever is that that you can't have both in some sense. So once you cash out what's going on here, negation gets in on the act. And that's usually taken to be proposition negation, which is why I've used that. But I quite agree that there are lots of other notions. Like, I mean, there's obviously between contradiction and contrariety and so on. The first point is about the difference between nichts and Nichtsein. Okay, nothing and non-being, nothing and not being. Look, I don't actually think these are the same. But what I've discovered by talking to lots of people, both my own students and very good philosophers, is they tend to run these two things together. You find yourself talking, you start talking about nothingness, and people will say you, well, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, so he's nothingness. Now that's just a confusion, right? And usually you can discuss this, and you can show people there's an important conceptual distinction here. Now, but for what it's worth, most people run together Nichtsein, not being, and nothingness. And I think Hegel does this. So I don't find it an untrackable act to interpret when he talks about nothingness as really he's talking about Nichtsein. And he goes on and says about that some things are and are not. That are not is clearly Nichtsein, right? So for that reason, I don't find it problematic to interpret the discussion of Nichts as Nichtsein.
Okay, thanks everybody for your questions. I'm going to go ahead and read a couple from YouTube. Is that okay? And we can finish with those. Okay. I have my own questions, but I'll save them for an email later.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So one is from Giuliano Infantino. So apologies if I mispronounced your name. Okay, question to Priest. On the basis of what you have said, would you say that for Hegel, contradictions are contextual and not global? That's the question.
I'm not sure what distinction is being drawn here.
I wonder if he's asking whether you think that, I mean, at the very beginning, I'm just, I don't know if this is what the questioner means, but when you were talking about, for example, Kant at the beginning, and how when we try to think about the unconditioned nature of the world, we end up in contradiction. I wonder if that's related to the question here. Do we, is the world, the unconditioned nature of the world, itself the seat of contradiction? Is there a, is the concept of totality itself contradictory? Or is it only, I guess, relative determinations? I guess that may be what is meant by contextual, I don't know. But I'm not sure exactly.
Okay, I wasn't thinking to interpret it like that. I was thinking more to interpret it as, do you get rid of them, that they occur locally in the context of the dialectic? Do they all disappear by the end? That's the way I was sort of tending to interpret it, but you have another way. Let's talk about this two ways. First of all, the way I was thinking of it, yes, they occur in the dialectic, but they never disappear.
Yeah.
Because given the old predicates or concepts, which don't, well, still with us because we're using them, they're there at the end, so to speak. And so they're global in that sense.
Okay, so really briefly, sorry, the questioner says that my rephrase is good.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
So
just guessing. Just guessing. Okay. So
all right, then yeah, the contradictions are as big as you can get, if I can put it rather metaphorically, because they apply to reality, and reality, you can't get much more global than reality. Sorry.
Right. So they're not just contextual, but they're global, you would say.
Well, if you're talking about reality, you know, what is?
Yeah.
Yes, it's contradictory.
Very good. Okay. Excellent. Okay, well, it is 10:01, so we've gone 1 minute over. So thank you, Graham, once again for your very clear and stimulating talk. We had a lot of questions immediately, so I think that's a good sign, as you said about Anthony's talk last time, or two weeks ago. So thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll be back next week for another stimulating lecture. I don't know who's on for next week. I'll have to check, but for everyone watching at home, tune in again.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. And some of these I've got to think about some more. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.